Okay, so welcome to the IHR Modern French History Seminar. And I am Tyson Lichter. I'm chairing this session. And today we are really delighted to have Carolyn Eichner here to present with us. And Carolyn Eichner is a professor of history and women's and gender studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, specializing in modern France and empire, gender, race, political radicalism, and the politics of names. A 2002 and 2003 Fulbright Research Scholar in Paris, and a spring 2023 Camargo Foundation Fellow. She has also held fellowships at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton and the Institute for Research in the Humanities at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her publications include Feminism's Empire, which we're here today to discuss, from Cornell University Press in 2022, the Paris Commune, A Brief History from Rutgers University Press, somehow kind of mind-bogglingly also in 2022, and Surmounting the Barricades, Women in the Paris Commune from Indiana University Press, 2004, which came out relatively recently with the Sorbonne in 2020 and was a Prix Augustin Thierry finalist. So just as a refresher, the way this generally works is that I'm going to pass the mic over to Carolyn to talk for a bit, and then we will have a Q&A session, which I'll moderate, and we're scheduled to close at around 7 p.m. London time, about an hour and a half. And so with that, Carolyn, take us away.
Thank you, Tyson. Thank you for that introduction. Thanks to the Modern French History Seminar and the Institute for Historical Research, and to everyone who's here. So I am here to talk about my recent book, Feminism's Empire. And I can sort of start by saying, talking about the origins of the book, which grew out of my work on women in the Paris Commune, my first book, Surmounting the Barricades, which focused on radical politics, gender, and class in the Paris Commune and then in the rest of the century. And so, afterwards, I was interested in thinking about race and thinking about empire, since that seemed to be like the most kind of pertinent thing in this time period. And so that's what I've done. So with this book, I looked for the first few French feminists to engage with empire by traveling into empire, either physically or literarily. And these feminists went into not just the French Empire, but the Ottoman Empire and the Turkish metropole, the Russian Empire, the American West, and then the French colonies of Algeria and New Caledonia. So I'm interested in the role of feminism and imperialism, the intersections of feminism and imperialism, and the way that they shape each other, and also feminism and anti-imperialism. And I'm also interested in the role of race and whiteness in feminisms. So these feminists were amongst the first and the third republic to critique empire. The first on the left. There were economists who critiqued empire because it was a waste of money. And also on the far right, it was a waste of energies and money for people who were not deserving. But so on the left, these feminists are amongst the very first to critique empire, and they have really disparate politics and really different goals. And feminism is the key factor that I think caused them to engage these questions of empire and to oppose empire in various ways. They were attuned to structures and practices of control and exploitation as feminists. So they all sought change within and beyond the metropole. They all critiqued existing empires, but they did not all critique imperialism per se. Some sought to transform it for their own uses and ends. All of their anti-imperialisms opposed exploitation, and none of their anti-imperialisms were absolute. There is no clear binary between pro-imperialist and anti-imperialist, which really makes a lot of this, very complex and often contradictory. So the feminists that I found who were the ones who went into empire were, sorry, I'm just setting my timer to make sure I don't talk too long. only I could master it. So the feminists were Louise Michel. So first of all, there are multiple kinds of feminisms in this period, and it worked out by coincidence that these 5 feminists fall along the range of different types of feminisms from this period. So the first is Louise Michel, who's probably the most well-known. She was a revolutionary anarchist feminist. She's one of the most, or the most well-known communard. Was used sort of as an image of all women in the Paris Commune, which is why I didn't really write about her very much in my first book at all. Slightly ironic that I do now, but it's because of the imperialism. But Michelle was often portrayed as, she's called the Red Virgin. She's sort of a caricature of who she was. And who she was a revolutionary and a theorist, a linguist, an ethnographer, novelist, poet, artist, and educator. And she was also a self-identified anti-imperialist, which was really rare at this time. And she developed those politics in the prison colony in New Caledonia after the Paris Commune. The next is Paula Mink, and this is moving from far left to slightly less far left. And Paula Mink was a revolutionary socialist feminist, communard, orator, journalist. She traveled and spoke and agitated. Also a self-identified anti-imperialist, and she went to Algeria in the middle of the 1880s. And then the next 2 are both Republican socialist feminists. So they're looking for change within the existing structure. And that's Léonie Rouzade, who's a novelist, orator, organizer. She wrote a novel, Le Monde Renversé, in 1870, critiquing and satirizing gender relations and empire. And so 1870, she's really one of the very first. And then the other Republican socialist feminist is Hubertine Auclair, who's best known as the sort of heart and soul and motor of the women's suffrage movement. She was also a journalist and a feminist imperialist. She was opposed to existing empires, but not to imperialism as a thing, as a force. And then finally, La Bontoir, who is she was a liberal monarchist feminist. She was an Orleaniste, classic kind of liberal, very happy with the existing hierarchies of class, but not of gender, also of race. She was very happy with the existing categories. She was a very well-known journalist and editor and travel writer in her time. Her books were published, went into multiple editions. They were reviewed in French and in English. And so she was critical of French imperialism, but not of imperialism per se. She felt that France did not deserve to imperialize. And she traveled to Turkey, Egypt, the American West, Jerusalem, Algeria, and Russia. Okay, so the book is composed of 6 chapters, and each looks at a different relationship between feminism and imperialism in France. Each looks at feminist engagement with questions of imperialism and equity. And each also illuminates the co-constitution of France and its empire. So chapter 1 is titled Ideologies and Intimacies of Imperialism. And this lays out the landscape of French feminisms and their relationships to imperialisms. Multiple feminisms, multiple imperialisms, multiple anti-imperialisms. So in this chapter, I'm re-examining mid to late 19th century imperial history with the inclusion of multiple feminisms, and that presents a much clearer understanding of the power matrices during this time period. The book uses a gendered lens to better understand power relations in both metropole and colonies. So for feminists, class and gender politics and the embodied experiences of empire shape their imperial critiques. So this is the ideologies in the title of the chapter. And French feminists, they were marginalized by politics and gender in the metropole. And then when they travel into empire, they're both othered and privileged as elite women in colonial spaces. And so in different ways, they use this othered perspective to try to redefine Frenchness. And this is what the intimacy is, their embodied experience, what they lived and what they saw. And intimacy, I'm not just talking about sexual intimacy, but physical and emotional proximity. So the quotidian interactions, as well as physical violence and regimes of control. I'm looking at these feminists are looking at gender orders in other metropoles and in colonies, and they're comparing with France. And in most cases, France comes up short, except in terms of women's social and sexual standings, which, for example, Audouard, when she's traveling through the American West, she is arguing that Yankees and whiteness, white people, are superior, and whiteness will protect Americans from Indians. So she has an anti, she doesn't use this term whiteness, but she does use Yankees. And then she speaks of Indians and Native Americans in incredibly denigrating language. And then Paul Mank is another example where when she travels to Algeria, she sees gender relations there as Arab patriarchy. And even though she's a self-identified anti-imperialist, she doesn't think about the element of imperialism in this context. Okay, so that's chapter 1. And then chapter 2 is titled Sex, Love, and the Law, Transforming Frenchness. And so this clearly picks up right from where chapter 1 ended, more than just physically. And this looks at the feminists who focused on law in their efforts to reconceptualize Frenchness according to their particular goals. So they're comparing gendered legal systems that they encounter in empire, and they're comparing it with France's Napoleonic Code. And almost universally in these cases, France and the Napoleonic Code comes up short. So they are coming from different feminist perspectives, different politics, they have different goals, but their interests intersect in law and the judicial regulation of intimacies, as well as the relationship between the state, traditional practices, and women's lives. So the less radical the class politics, the more likely one of these feminists is to focus on law. Because again, law is reformist. It's not revolutionary. So Audouard, Auclair, and Rousade focus on law. Make very little, and Michel not at all. So there are 3 sites that are shaped by patriarchal law and power relations, and that these women all look at, and those are marriage, women's legal status, and polygamy. So in terms of marriage, marriage is sort of an obvious one. It's a gendered, social, sexual, economic, and legal construct. At Audouard, she sees that divorce is legal in Turkey and it is not under the Napoleonic Code. So there's a comparative that for that. And she also, when she's in the United States, she had understood that the miscegenation laws protected enslaved Black women, that gave them bodily autonomy. And so her overvaluation of the letter of the law led her to argue that enslaved Black women have greater bodily autonomy than French women do under the Napoleonic Code. And Auclair argued that marriage was an economic disaster for French women, and she was also opposed to women losing their name with marriage. And then the second category, women's legal status, in this Audouard sees that Turkey has paternity suits, which are not legal in France. In the French context, the late Rachel Fuchs has written brilliantly on the absence of paternity suits being legal. And then finally, polygamy is the final category that they look at. And Auclair attacks France for having separate legal codes for Algeria and France, where polygamy is legal in Algeria and not in France. And she's not arguing it for it to be legal in France. And then Audouard, who talks about the Mormons and polygamy. And I'm going to read a brief excerpt here from the beginning of chapter 2. Crossing the Rocky Mountains, Olympe Audouard reported in 1871, quote, "One finds oneself in Utah, a state colonized by the followers of Brigham Young. Frenchmen, unhappily for French women, also support polygamy. For those attempted to join the Latter-day Saints in order to benefit from this institution, I give a little charitable advice. In Salt Lake City, a man must feed all the women he marries. Wives have the right of divorce, but the husband does not. He must give his name and bread to all of his children. Frenchmen, so accustomed to taking pleasures without any inconveniences, would undoubtedly miss the Napoleonic Code, which grants men complete impunity for all their bad passions," close quote. In this passage from her account, À travers l'Amérique, North America, Audouard likened French men's lack of fidelity to a kind of polygamy, while mocking their absence of responsibility for their sexual behavior. Her stark set of comparisons cataloged the marital obligations that Mormon men had and French men did not, and the rights that Mormon women held, but that French women lacked. She stressed that in terms of marriage and sexual relations, the French state required of men distinctly fewer responsibilities than did the polygamous Mormon society. Similarly, it granted women fewer rights than did the Latter-day Saints. In certain ways, Audouard contended, the Napoleonic Code of Law undercut monogamy, enabling a sort of French polygamy at a time when France allowed literal polygamy in its colonies. As Audouard voyaged to, quote, America, the Kingdom of the Mormons, the European Turkey, and the Asian Turkey, Egypt, Syria, Palestine, Algeria, Italy, England, and Germany, close quote, she paid particular attention to women's status under law. As a faithful Catholic and a liberal monarchist, Audouard did not resist existing hierarchies, except gender. She compared the structure and influence of gendered legal systems in imperial contexts with that of France, pointedly highlighting examples of France's greater gender inequality. Audouard was the only travel writer among the 5 feminists. Yet like her, Hubertine Auclair and Léonie Rouzade also came away from their imperial encounters with new perspectives on France and Frenchness. As revolutionaries, Paul Menck and Louise Michel rarely sought such nation-based reform. Michel and Menck stood apart in another way. Unlike the 3 others, they took little interest in law. Feminists' focus on legal structures varied, generally increasing in correlation with the moderation of their class politics and with their adherence to structural status quo. Those who worked for change within the current political order tended to focus on jurisprudence to a much greater extent than did revolutionaries or anarchists who sought to overthrow or undermine entire existing systems. Promoting legal reform reflected confidence in a legal structure having sufficient flexibility and capaciousness to allow for serious change. Feminists concerned with legal codes recognized that the gendered nature of laws reflected the dominant gender ideology of the metropole or colony from which it emerged. Audouard, Auclair, and Rouzade evocatively and critically described the rights and legal statuses of women in those places, comparing them most often positively to those of women in France. These assessments became part of their efforts to rethink and transform Frenchness and to change France. So chapter 3 is La Citoyenne, Alternate Empires. And this focuses in on Hubertine Auclair and her newspaper, La Citoyenne, which she began publishing in 1881, and it lasted about 10 years. She lost control of it before the end. So in this, she develops her feminist imperialism. The newspaper itself is the first French suffragist newspaper, and it's also the first feminist publication to engage questions of imperialism. So Auclair's feminist imperialism is a combination of Republican universalism and French assimilationism. It's a racialized politics at the intersections of republicanism, socialism, and feminism. She published it from France, and then she moves to Algeria, and this takes her already existing interest in empire to a much higher level. She follows her longtime partner to Algeria. And so for Auclair, she believes that it is France's responsibility to elevate society via women's equality. And so if women in France were enfranchised, they would then take action to make sure that there was gender equity in Algeria and in the colonies. So she believes in the radical potential, the radical within her framework, potential of French republicanism. And she feels that this is a way to elevate the colonies. It's in some ways different than British imperial feminism in that while her motivation is definitely for French women to get the vote, it is also, she seems to genuinely have an interest in what she believes is the fact that everyone really wants to be French, that the Algerians want to be French, and that they want this kind of help. Then chapters 4 and 5 shift focus to New Caledonia and center on Louise Michel. So chapter 4 is titled Imprisoned, Colonized, Civilization and Translation in New Caledonia. So this chapter looks at the politics of everyday colonial encounters in the New Caledonian context. And this is the context in which Michel's anti-imperialism is forged and shaped. There are 3 realms that this chapter focuses on. The first is the spatial, and that's examining the gendered nature of the penal colony. And the New Caledonian penal colony is a very masculinized space, and Michel critiques this in a number of ways. And the other focus, the second focus, is the focusing on the traditional in the indigenous context, and that's Michel translated and transcribed indigenous Kanak oral tales. So she's in prison, but it's a prison without walls. The prisoners, there's some prisoners who are in physical prison, but most of the communards who are sent to New Caledonia in the wake of the Commune, and there are 4,500 of them, of which 25 are women. 25, that's all. And so they're on a peninsula that is guarded on one end, and it's a very arid space, even though most of New Caledonia is quite lush, and these urban communards are sort of dumped there to survive. And so there are some contacts with the indigenous Kanak, and Michel is interested in them and had done research before going to New Caledonia. She was likely one of the only communards to actually see something positive out of going there and this experience. And she values the Kanak as people with a culture, and she values their traditions, their orality, their spirituality. And this is very different than the dominant French perspective of the Kanak. The French colonial authorities think of the Kanak as amongst their lowest colonial subjects with sub-Saharan Africans because they are Black. The Kanak are the New Caledonian is categorized as Melanesia. This is a racialized construction of the South Pacific with Polynesia being people who are closer to white and the French considered more beautiful, and Melanesia, people who are Black, and the French considered less beautiful. And this obviously is a categorization, the Polynesia and Melanesia that persists. So Michelle has a very different perspective. She is fascinated by the Kanak. She sees them as humans with culture, and she wants to translate and transcribe their oral tales. She does this with the help of a Kanak man named Daomi. And at the same time, she terms the Kanak Stone Age and childlike, and feels as though some Western education, radical education, she's developing an anarchist pedagogy at the same time, could elevate and help elevate the Kanak. And so in her process of writing down and publishing these tales, she cleans them up. She removes any references to anything scatological or bodily, and she takes out elements of misogyny that are in tales or in the culture. The first volume of the essays are first published serially in a communard prisoner-owned newspaper in New Caledonia in 1875, and then they're re-edited in, and then they're published in a volume in 1875, and then she significantly re-edits and rewrites and further cleans up the tales for a second publication in 1885 once she's back in France. So Michelle is self-described anti-imperialist, recognizing the value of indigenous knowledge and experience, and yet at the same time cannot escape the fact that she's a French woman in the 19th century and has these kinds of ideas about racial hierarchy and civilizational evolution. And it just underscores the impossibility of a clear binary between pro-imperial and anti-imperial at this time. And the third realm, after the prison colony and the tales, is the conceptual, and that's the fact that she's theorizing the logic of French civilizational rankings. And that's really interspersed within the things I've been talking about. And basically, Michelle critiques the extinction narrative, the idea, the assertion by France and other imperializing powers that indigenous people are just naturally going to go extinct. And this is the narrative that's central to settler colonial projects. And for Michelle, the Kanak are more civilized than the French in certain respects and less civilized in other respects. And so chapter 5, universal language, universal education, universal revolution. This is the second chapter on New Caledonia and Michelle. And this chapter, while the last looked at the quotidian, the everyday, this looks at the methods of turning revolutionary ideals, and Kanak knowledge into universal praxis. Michelle was a universalist, but not the French version of universalism, an anarchist version of it. And so this chapter looks at 3 foci in which she's trying to develop these universal ideas: language, education, and revolution. So in terms of language, the New Caledonia is an archipelago, and they had and still have 26 different languages. And then they use a pidgin as a trade language called Biche-le-Mar, and it was developed out of, first it was an English-based version, then it was a French-based version by this time, multiple languages. And this is at a period in which universal languages were seen as a possible way of surmounting divisions between peoples. So this is the period when Esperanto is developed, but Esperanto is not the only one. There are multiple other created languages, including Volapük. And but for Michelle, Biche-le-Mar is functional. It exists, it's being used, and it's organic. And so she sees this as an example of how the Kanak are more civilizationally developed than the French. And she's also, while she's there, she's searching for an originary human language. She's a self-trained linguist. And so while she's there, she has many, many books sent to her. And she kept a black notebook, which is at the Institute, the International Institute for Social History in Amsterdam. And when I first did work on women in the Commune a long time ago, I was able to actually get the black notebook to hold and read, which was kind of wonderful, but now it's digitized, which is better for the document, obviously. But in this notebook, she has comparative linguistic lists and fragments, dozens of languages, looking for language groups, language families, looking for linguistic commonalities as a way of surmounting barriers between peoples. The second focus is education. Michelle is trained as a teacher. She has worked as a teacher. She develops feminist and anarchist pedagogies over the period of her life. And as in New Caledonia, the indigenous, what we call indigenous ways of knowing, really influenced the development of her anarchist pedagogy. She teaches the Kanak. She holds a Sunday school once a week, which the French do not want to happen, and she ultimately has to sort of hide, out in the bush with her students to have this go on, and she learns from the Kanak, and yet she still has this idea of Western education to help them catch up civilizationally. She is rooted in Enlightenment positivism, and so it's this complex mix. And then the final bit in this chapter is revolution, and it focuses on 3 revolutions. It's the Paris Commune, and they're all overlapping in the 1870s, and then the Algerian Kabyle rising up against French imperialism at the same time as the Commune. There was also an Algerian Commune, which was mostly, it was French people who were mostly had been exiled after 1848, and they created a commune, as there were in multiple other cities in Paris as well, but that was not anti-imperialist at all. But the Kabyle were anti-imperialist, and the Kabyle are then exiled to New Caledonia as well. And then in 1878, when all of these prisoners are there, the Kanak rise up against the French. And the Kanak had risen up against the French a number of times, but this one was different. There had been a break between uprisings. This seemed to be very well planned, and it was a surprise, and it was brutal, and it was responded to with massive force by the French. And many communards fought on the side of the French against the Kanak. And so did a number of the Algerian Kabyle. Michel was the only communard to consistently side with the Kanak against the French. It's as though the communards chose whiteness and Frenchness over liberation, only 7 years after the brutal crushing of the Commune. And I think much of this is attributed to race, and it's attributed to a lack of anti-imperialism on the left at this time period. So I here am going to read another little excerpt. Okay. In her memoirs, Michel stated that, quote, "The task of teachers, these obscure soldiers of civilization, is to give people an intellectual means to revolt," close quote. Traveling to Algeria in 1904, as she had promised the exiled Kabyle insurgents she had encountered in New Caledonia in the prison colony decades earlier, Michel strove to foment an anti-imperial uprising. She lectured to audiences of 400 to 500 people per night, a significant number of whom were educators. Anarchist Ernest Giraud, with whom Michel traveled and spoke, wrote that, quote, "As in all of Algeria, the corps of teachers stood out with enthusiasm, its spirit truly secular and assimilationist." It's anti-militarist, close quote. Again and again, reports specifically mention the attendance of teachers and their fervor, engaging crowds with what one newspaper described as a, quote, "an incontestable eloquence." Michel brought together the central elements of her universal vision: language, education, and revolution. Mixed crowds, including those in traditional Camille clothing, quote, in the middle of the toilette européenne, close quote, came to hear the renowned orator and revolutionary. Quote, each will aid the other, Michel professed, and humanity will march in the steps of giants. Each will speak a piece of the universal language, that of humanity, close quote. Michel understood education, language, and revolution as interwoven. Words and ideas together could spark liberatory action. They could bring peoples together, and they could overturn repression. In Paris in the 1860s and during the Commune, Michel developed and practiced feminist, equitable pedagogies. In New Caledonia in the 1870s, she introduced egalitarian and anarchist Western ideas, carefully chosen and transmitted to educate and advance the Kanak, while simultaneously promoting Kanak knowledge and language to improve Europeans. Following her return from New Caledonia in exile, Michel spent decades traveling across France, as well as through Belgium, the Netherlands, and Spain. She tried to come to the United States, but they wouldn't let her in. Rousing audiences with impassioned oratory, relating histories of oppressions and uprisings, illuminating injustices, and striving to stir revolt. In the 1880s, she worked to appropriate the French language through a set of novels, stripping the language of elite sanction and radically democratizing it to reflect its oral creolization in the hands of the working class. In London in the 1890s, she used anarchist instruction to help shape enlightened, multilingual, and liberated European children as a means of advancing global solidarity. Finally, in Algeria in 1904, she promoted education and free thought as a means to uniting Algerians and Europeans in anti-colonial liberation. Linguistic unity, anarchist feminism, and anti-imperialism ultimately interconnected all of these. Highlighting the intersection of capitalism and imperialism, she queried in a volume of her memoirs, quote, what purpose do the colonies serve if they do not produce fortunes for their exploiters? Close quote. She blamed patriarchy for, quote, the spoliation inflicted on women's intelligence, close quote, for blocking the light of knowledge from women and thus stunting their intellectual growth. So the final chapter, chapter 6, is titled Familiar Stranger, the Figure of the Jew. And this chapter looks at the ways in which the three of these feminists used the figure of the Jew as a familiar stranger, something at home and in empire, and used it for political purposes in very, very different ways. So Audouard was an anti-Semite, clear cut. Auclair instrumentalized anti-Semitism for political purposes. And Michel was opposed to anti-Semitism and opposed to all religion. So they all used the figure of the Jew to make gendered claims about race and civilization. They all wrote about Jews in imperial context and in France. And moving from left to right with these feminists, the further to the right their class politics, the more accepting they were of the status quo, the less tolerance they had of others. And they all used Jewish difference to foster their own agenda. And Jewish difference is a concept developed by Lisa Silverman for the context of Central Europe, but it works very well here also. And it's the idea that Jewish difference is something that is socially constructed and historically specific. It is constructed against what is the acceptable Christian norm, and it is very much of a gendered construct. So Audouard, she had a racialized and gendered version of the figure of the Jew. Her anti-Semitism interwove her liberalism, her elite class politics, and her Catholicism with the assertion of Jews rejecting or killing Christ. She described Jews as dirty and dishonest. She wrote that Jews have caves filled with gold, that all Jews were wealthy, and that they only had the appearance of being impoverished because they were too cheap or unwilling to spend the money gold on them, even on themselves. Her description of male Jews was feminized and female Jews was highly sexualized. She made these analyses in Constantinople and in Jerusalem. And Auclair, as I said, instrumentalized anti-Semitic tropes and arguments. She used the figure of the Jew to advance her politics. She basically was willing to ally with anyone to support women's suffrage. She wrote 12 articles in the virulently anti-Semitic newspaper, Le Libre Parole, Drumont's newspaper. She pandered to anti-Republican anti-Semitisms, even though she was very much of a Republican. And she wrote about Jews as foreign, argued that German man could come to France, ultimately become a citizen, but that we, daughters of Joan of Arc, we Christian French women cannot. And then finally, Michel argues that capitalism created the Jew, and that capitalism disfigured everyone, and that the stereotypes of the Jew were created by capitalism. And she is anti-Semitism, but she wrote a novel, The Claque d'Ancre, in which she uses these tropes of anti-Semitism. It's a story of a wealthy Jewish man who is, a horrible boss and greedy, and he is the stereotype. And he has two children. And the boy and the girl, the young man and the young woman, and the revolution is coming, and they are leading the revolution. And then the revolution comes, the young man dies, the daughter leads into the new world. And then at this point, the father is exposed to the ideas of Kropotkin. He realizes that he has lost his true self, and that in his youth, he was a poet and he cared about people, and he abandons capitalism. Capitalism is over in this new world, and goes back to his true self. And so it's capitalism, not Jewishness, that created this kind of aberration, kind of being. So for all three of them, it's the availability and the legibility of the figure of the Jew that leads them to use it for their political purposes. The Jews are in France, they're an empire, they're foreign and familiar, and they were a useful and comprehensible political tool. I can stop there.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Carolyn. That was really, really fascinating, to be sure. So now we're going to open it up to questions. And you can sort of ask a question either by using the raise your hand feature, which I think is now under reactions on Zoom, or by typing it into the chat, and I'll read your question off. So yeah, floor is open for questions. Great. One straight away from Jennifer Sessions.
Hi, Carolyn.
Jen!
It's so nice to be here and to see at least names of fellow French historians in the middle of a Monday in January. And thank you so much for this. I cannot wait to read the whole book as a whole after seeing so many pieces of it. And also my students love the Eau Claire article in the fall. So,
Thank you.
Teaches beautifully. If anybody is looking for teaching. But so my question about the book is kind of, which I hadn't thought about until you started kind of walking through the chapters, was about the geography of this, empire of feminism, of French feminists, and kind of the places that they focus on and the places that they don't. And I guess I'm wondering if you have thought about that, if you have a sort of an explanation. Is it just conjunctural? Are there figures you didn't bring into the book who talk about focus on other places? But I'm curious, why do these places get included and other parts of the empire not?
Okay, thank you for that question. So it is a combination of like Louise Michel being sent to the prison colony, right? And then choosing to go to Algeria. And then Audouard being a travel writer and choosing to go to places that she's interested in and that she thinks can sell books. I did not leave any other feminists out. I mean, these are the first 5 feminists that were engaging with empire. So the 4 of them traveling into empire, and then Rosade writing this novel, you know, it's a Le Monde Renversé it's a fictionalized Muslim sultanate, and she's captured by pirates and brought there and is able to, you know, take over basically as a European woman and as a feminist and flip gender relations. And so there's the fictionalized world. And then the others, it is, I mean, I followed them. That is really it.
But I guess if you're following them, is there a reason that they're interested in these places and not others? In this sets of problematics that these places kind of service, as opposed to some of the things that might have come out if they'd gone to, you know, the Antilles or something else.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, again, you know, Michelle goes to New Caledonia because of the prison colony, and then she promises to go to Algeria. She makes it there at the end of her life, basically kills her. I think with Mink, she's, you know, the focus on Algeria is, you know, because it's part of Greater France, and so she wants to see what Algeria is like for herself, and she goes there for a year. And this is something that has not been written about, and that I originally found a year-long gap in her police records, and it took a while to figure out where she was. And so I actually just wrote another article about this, but there's very little on her being there, except for some newspaper stuff. But she just, you know, wanted to see what it was like for herself. You know, Audouard, I mean, you know, I know that her first trip to Turkey, she goes because her father's going, and she's very young, and then she just, you know, I don't know why she chose places, aside from the fact of, you know, she needed to go to different places to write more travel narratives. So she had married young to a cousin who ran off with her money, and she had little children, and she wrote to live very comfortably, because, you know, she apparently lived at the Grand Hotel de Paris for a while. But this was, you know, she was selling books. You know, Rosade is fictional, and Auclair follows her longtime partner to Algeria. I don't think she would not have gone otherwise. She had been involved with this man for years, refused to marry him because she was opposed to marriage as, you know, institution. He was a justice of the peace. He's sent to Algeria. He had tuberculosis, and he was clearly going downhill. And so she married him and followed him there for 4 years. He died. She came back. So this, I mean, it's really like they're circumstantial in all sorts of different ways. And I just followed them.
Great question from Andrew Smith.
Hello, thank you very much for your paper. Sorry, I'm lowering my hand. So, thank you very much for your paper. I thought it was fascinating. It sounds, I can't wait to read the book as well. It made me, some of what you were talking about made me think of having heard Moira Cross talking about Flora Tristan's kind of travels to Peru and back, and that kind of, again, those intersections of, well, I guess kind of intersections, if you see what I mean, of class, of race, of gender, of, you know, these impinging issues, intersecting issues. And I wondered, it made me think, one of the things that surprised me about Moira's paper on that was hearing about, I guess, some of the kind of traces that somebody like Flora Tristan left, often the naming of women's refuges and kind of other institutions like that. And it made me wonder, partially maybe you've answered it in response to the last question, but is there any sense of kind of traces left by the travels of these women, these feminists that you're talking about, within the movements in the countries that they visited, Or, I mean, you mentioned there, perhaps it's kind of circumstantial or ephemeral, kind of passing through. Are there longer echoes of their kind of passage through these places? I guess.
Well, yes, for New Caledonia. Michelle is really seen as a somewhat heroic figure in New Caledonia. I think it's very interesting by the Kanak today. For example, in 2005, it was the 100th anniversary of her death. They held a huge conference, and in her honor, and there's a recognition. They are able to historically contextualize Michelle and to see that she was the one communard, the one French person who was the deportee who valued Kanak culture and recognized the Kanak as human beings, and supported their revolt. While at the same time talking about them as childlike and savage, but there's clearly an ability to sort of historically contextualize her and to see her as a really important figure. I was in New Caledonia doing research maybe 10 years ago, and I was really a bit surprised by the extent of that.
Thank you very much, Teresa.
Thank you.
Well, I have a question of my own, as it happens. And let me sort of join the chorus of folks saying I'm excited to read the whole book. I think it's going to be really, really great. I suppose a couple of things, actually. One, following on a little bit from what Jennifer brought up, is this aspect, and Andrew too, this aspect of mobility. It strikes me as that there are sort of two forms of mobility that came through today. One, obviously, voluntary people doing travel writing and so on. The other, involuntary, of course. If you're deported to a prison colony, it's by definition voluntary. So it'd be interesting to see or hear to what extent that shaped this sort of trans-cultural feminism or anti-imperial critique or something like that. And I'm just fascinated by this figure of, why all of them, but by Michelle. Really interesting stuff. What you were describing about her take on anti-Semitism sounds strikingly close to what Marx said on the Jewish question, which I think would probably align with her politics from what I'm gathering. But I suppose, in terms of an actual question to ask, you had mentioned that she had a critique of the prison colony in New Caledonia as sort of more patriarchal than it should be, perhaps more masculine than it should be, and that was a part of its sort of injustice. And so I just sort of love to hear what were the specifics of her critique of that? How might that tie in, if it did, to her relationship to the indigenous Kanak population? Thank you.
Okay, so in terms of the first part, the mobility by choice or not, Michelle is a really unusual case, right? I think that for most of the French people who were deported to New Caledonia, they were not happy to be there, right? They were really, really, really resistant. And there was Alice Bullard wrote a really wonderful book, Exile to Paradise. She talks about fatal nostalgia, people dying of nostalgia, and take months for the mail to get there, and they're far from families. It was very, very hard. But Michelle, she wrote to someone, I can't remember who, when she left, possibly to Rochefort, because Rochefort was deported. Anyway, she wrote to somebody and said that, I'm not going to travel, however many leagues it is, for 4 months and not learn anything and not make a difference. So, she goes into this, she did research in advance. She had arranged with the French Botanical Society to do some research on plants. They wanted her to look for plants that might be useful in other colonies, and then the linguistic interest, and she basically also is a self-trained ethnographer. She is using her time. So I think that the being deported for the rest, the rest of them, it was it did not make them attuned to issues of empire. But for her, it really did. It really did, because she just, took a very, very different, perspective. And Paul Mink is a really interesting example when she goes to Algeria. So she's an anti-statist in general. So before the Commune, Mink is an anarchist and Michel is a Blanquiste socialist. And then after the Commune, he switched places. After the Commune, Mink thinks you need much more top-down to get the revolution going. And Michel thinks that the men in positions of authority did a terrible job and you need bottom up. And so, so Mink is basically, she believes that they're, conspiratorial kind of socialism, but also she travels, speaks, agitates, is opposed to the state. And then she goes to Algeria, and it's like all she sees is male Arab misogyny. I mean, it is a really racist kind of assessment she has. And then at the one time in her life, and I mean, maybe I haven't read everything she's written, read a lot. She suggests that maybe France can do something about this, that France can do something about the kind of gender oppression in Algeria. And it's just like, it's so inconsistent with everything else that, she has said or done. And so she goes by choice, but it's like these experiences shape them, shape their politics. And then in turn, the ideas come back to France. I mean, it's, it's the whole co-constitutive, nature. Odoa has experiences where she goes to a Coptic Christian wedding in Egypt, and she's everywhere she goes, she's this bourgeois woman, and she gets really treated with a kind of deference. And but women are touching her, and they're touching her clothing. They don't have the same sense of personal space, and her clothing seems amazing, and she seems and it is just flipping her out. She just is so uncomfortable with that kind of intimacy, right? And then she also is invited to witness a virginity test, which also is, like an 11-year-old bride, which she describes it as quite brutal. So these are the intimate experience that they have, shapes their politics, shapes the way that they report back on this. It's, I don't know if that is actually answering your question.
No, that's really fascinating. Thank you. Though I suppose I had another part in my long-winded.
Oh, I forgot. Sorry.
Disquisition. Yeah.
Looks like I only wrote down the first part, and then I talked so long that I forgot what it was. I apologize.
No problem. No, I was just curious about what Michel's critique of the kind of the distinctively and illegitimately or sort of wrongly male space of the prison colony in New Caledonia was like. Just want to hear more about it.
Okay. Sorry about that. So the women were supposed to be kept with the nuns and not in the regular context of the prison, either the physical, walled prison or on the peninsula. And it's far away from this. And so apparently somehow in the way that their conviction was articulated, the women were supposed to be treated exactly the same way as the men. And so on the ship pulls into Nouméa harbor, and Michel and Nathalie Lamel, and were two of the 25 women, the two most well-known by far, realize that they are going to be taken elsewhere and, refuse to allow this to happen, threaten to jump off the ship, and somehow are able to have this, happen. And then she, talks about the way in which, women are seen as a danger, and that the assumption of that the women are all prostitutes. And, it's a sort of, a surveillance on top of a surveillance. And that's it kind of in a nutshell.
one question. It looks like we have a question from the chat. This is from Alexia Yates. And she says she's interested in hearing more about your use of the term intimacy, quotation marks here, to describe proximity and material relations. Can you say more about why and how intimacy is useful to you in this research? Yeah, so that's it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, I mean, it's thinking about the embodied experience of these white French women and how this shapes their politics, shapes their experience, and also then shapes the experience of the indigenous people, and in the context in which they're sort of showing up, right? And I mean, I think about the ways in which they are. I mean, there's the prison colony, but then if they're not in a prison colony and they're sort of just living as European women, I mean, Audouard is probably the most extreme example, where she's being waited on and sort of cared for, and as well as they transported. Like Audouard crosses the desert, and so she has to be led and escorted, and someone is setting up a tent at night, and I mean, there's this kind of closeness, and that's a kind of an experience, an embodied experience that shapes the way people think about emotionally and intellectually whatever their experience is. And so I think it's really important, like when thinking about the way that both ideology and these embodied intimate experiences shape this intersection, this point where these French women are engaging with people in colonial contexts or in other imperial metropoles. Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up to that? I like this question about the intimacy, and it actually I had taught the article version, the FHS article version of the Eau Claire chapter last fall, and we read it with Vanita Dada's article on Buffalo Bill at the 1900 World's Fair, kind of as a pair of readings on gender and empire at the turn of the century. And one of the things that the students got really interested in, and they kind of carried it actually all through the semesters, was 20th century France, was about the kind of the trade-offs between a kind of more biographical approach focused on an individual and the kinds of entree that gives you to exactly that world of personal experience that you were just talking about, and something that kind of looks at a cultural phenomenon or a set of cultural phenomena in a more impersonal way, the way that the Buffalo Bill article did. And so I wonder, since you're somebody who has worked in this kind of more biographical mode in a lot of your work, can you talk to us about kind of what you see as the power of that way of thinking about this history? I mean, to a certain extent, it's kind of the default of the intellectual historian, but it's not the only way to organize it. And so what can you talk to us a little bit about the biographical approach and structure for the book?
Yeah. So my first book, Surmounting the Barricades, Women in the Paris Commune, was really structured around 3 communard women, right? So it was very clearly structured in these 3 sections, these three different women: Elizabeth Dmitrieff, André Leo, and Paul Lemaque. Paul Lemaque shows up apparently in everything I write. I didn't want to do that again with this, but I did. When I'm looking at, especially, I'm really interested in radical change, right? Radical political feminist change. And for me, the entree is through the people making the change. And so this book is not structured in the same way, right? And this is, and I sort of really specifically did not structure it around, 5 people. And it's clearly, uneven. I mean, there are 2 chapters on Michel. The one on Auclair is not only on Auclair. There is stuff about utopian socialist feminists, the precursors. I just didn't have time to talk about everything, and this was neater. And then the other chapters are kind of a melange in different ways, because I just didn't want to do the completely biographical. But of course, you have to introduce them, and they are, to me, fascinating characters, and they give you a lens. And then the fact that they happen to fall on this range of feminist politics was kind of astonishing, and really, served my purpose as well, as this, this range of lenses to understand the intersections of class, race, and gender politics. That said, the work I'm doing now on names is not like that. Though the first article I published was. It was on feminist opposition to the patronym in 19th century France, which I basically came across while doing all this other work. And that does center Flamenc and Robertine Auclair, and then the utopian socialist feminists. But the other parts that I am working on now are much more, they don't focus on individuals. I'm looking at the Napoleonic mandate that Jews take permanent last names at the beginning of the century, and then the French state doing the same for Algerian Muslims at the end of the century. And it's a really different kind of approach. And it's very fascinating, but in some ways, I like the, relatability. I don't know. I like the human element, and it doesn't have to be, centered on just, a couple of them. But I feel like that it's extremely evocative to look at a person within their historical context as a way to better understand that historical context, both from their perspective and then my looking in on them.
Yeah, there were students who felt very strongly about that, the advantages of focusing on an individual, but then there were, students who raised, the very logical questions about representativity and all of these things. It was actually a totally fascinating question. So
that's great. That's really great. That's super interesting to know too, because like your first question, where it's like why New Caledonia, Algeria, then Egypt, why the American West? It's a lot of places. Took a long time to write this, but it's I'm following them. There's always the idea you follow the sources, and in this case, I'm like following the subjects too.
This is a great conversation. We have another question too from Constance.
Yes, thank you. Hi, Erin. It's a great talk. Well, I've been lucky enough to read the book, and I just wanted to pick up on the point of the biographical form, because I assumed it was a bit of a feminist statement, actually, because the group biography is such a canonical genre, and I thought that was really, really well done. So I was wondering whether that was perhaps part of your intention. I hope it was.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yes. Thank you for pointing that out. Sometimes it's just so kind of internalized that I neglect to articulate it. Yes, I feel responsible as the voice of anybody I'm writing about. I feel responsible to get as close as I can to what I think is a true, honest representation of what they did and said. What they thought is, probably outside of the realm of, definitely outside of the realm of what I'm trying to do or capable of doing, but it is absolutely a feminist statement and endeavor, right? So this is, looking at the history of feminism's, engagement with imperialism is that there's also a feminist project, because it is also just a historian's project, because it's I hope, makes us better understand how not just feminism is shaped, but how imperialism and anti-imperialism and all of these hierarchies are shaped. Because it's like you have so much scholarship on empire that, you know, ignores or marginalizes women and gender, but feminists are, and feminism, which is feminisms, which is such a significant intellectual movement at this time and social movement, it's just erased. So yes, thank you very much for that question.
I suppose if it's okay, I'll jump in here with another question. I think this sort of follows from what Jennifer and Constance brought up, but I'm curious what you said about sort of, you know, following the sources and following the subjects, and how that ties into this focus on sort of intimacy and experience. And I suppose, you know, was it necessary to write in this sort of prosopographical mode, sort of serial biography mode? Was that the condition of possibility of getting at this sort of aspect of intimate experience, or did the desire to get at intimate experience come first before the sort of the rhetorical embedment, if you will?
The desire to get at the intimate experience came afterwards, because maybe it's not something that I was really thinking that much about when I wrote my first book, right? And which was, again, much more biographical, collective. It was what I termed at that point, new biography. And this is less biographical, but thinking about the co-constituency of empire and metropole just really made me think about, you know, these women show up there in white female bodies. And at different points, I actually mentioned this article I just finished writing about Mink in Algeria and Michelle. It seems a little crazy, but trust me. But it also has to do with age. And the age of the female body that shows up, and the way that that's, you know, responded to, and the way that it experiences it. In, you know, Michelle's case, it's the little less things she does. So yeah. So it's basically, I mean, and I think for me at least, you know, continuing to work, you know, having continued to work on, you know, focusing on centering on individuals in certain ways, just made me think about even, you know, I mean, you know, it depends on, you know, what I'm reading. And I'm sort of desperately trying to think about who the scholar who writes about intimacies and empire, but at the moment, somebody maybe. But, you know, after reading a lot of her work, Ann Stoller, thank you. God, I've been sitting here for like, you know, yeah, after reading a lot of Ann Stoller, you know, she's really helped me think in different and more kind of, you know, expansive ways, and really to think about this, the ideas of intimacy and empire. So yeah, so it's like, you know, hopefully one's thought changes from one book to the next, and so yeah.
Please everyone join me in giving Carolyn a hand for a really great talk, and a really great way to kick off our term here at the IHR. So thanks again, Carolyn. Thank you for a good talk, and I hope everyone has a good rest of the day.
Thanks very much. I really enjoyed it. Thank you all for coming. Thanks so much, and thanks for the great conversation.